Thanks, Tim. Hello, everyone. Yeah, as Tim said, my name's Adam Cawood. So I'm going to say hi and then turn my camera off. So hello. First, thanks to PSGD and Tim for inviting me to do this talk. So today we're going to be talking about fracture containment and propagation in a multi-layered carbonate succession at Canyon Lake Gorge, Texas. This is a study that was carried out by the authors you see here. So myself, Nina Bowness, David Farrell, and Kevin Smart at Southwest Research Institute. I should mention that we've just had a paper back from review on this stuff. So the majority of the work you're going to see presented today comes from that paper that was submitted to Geological magazine. And the lead author on that paper is Nina Bowness, listed here, who is one of our Southwest Research Institute interns. Nina is a Trinity University graduate, and she's been with us since, I think, around about the middle of last year, and she's been really helping a bunch with this work. This study was funded by a Southwest Research Institute internal research and development project, and you can see the title of that research and development project down there. So prediction of natural fracture abundance with 3D drone imagery, semi-automatic feature detection, and multivariate analysis. Okay, so off we go then. So, oh, yes, it is working. Okay, so a little bit of background, a couple of slides on Southwest Research Institute. We've got over 2,700 employees in 9 technical divisions. And the picture there on the top right you're looking at is our lovely green campus on the western side of San Antonio, 1,500 acres, 2.3 million feet of labs and offices. And throughout our 75-year history, we're celebrating our 75th anniversary this year, 2022, and we've been awarded more than 1,400 patents and 50 R&D 100 awards. Southwest Research Institute's income is kind of split equally. You can see in that pie chart there between government subcontracts, government contracts, and commercial work. And we've really got a pretty strong reputation for timely, innovative solutions and consulting work, technical solutions. Southwest Research Institute is a not-for-profit organization. And so what that means is that all of our income gets reinvested into the Institute, into research, into capital equipment and infrastructure. And one of the really cool things that we do, and one of the things that attracted me to the job initially, was they have a very strong internal research and development program. And the idea behind this program is to turn good or innovative ideas into advanced technologies. So a sort of pre-market technologies where we can really investigate the nitty-gritty of new technical solutions. Financial year 2021, we had 98 new internal research projects, and expenditure on those projects was more than $8 million. As I said, the results here presented here today were funded by one of these research and development projects. Okay, so that's Southwest Research Institute very quickly. And then, so our group, the Structural Geology and Geomechanics group, we focus, like the name suggests, on structural geology, from outcrop to subsurface at a range of scales. We work right down from the microstructure scale to regional, almost plate scale tectonics. We've just completed a couple of projects for the Oil and Gas Corporation of Newfoundland and Labrador, looking at transform margins and on Southeast Newfoundland and the Orphan Basin, and then right down to the grain scale, structural geology. Stress analysis and geomechanical modeling, we do plenty of that as well. Kevin Smart leads most of that effort, physical analog modeling. And then more recently, since I've joined the team in the last 2 years, we've added drone-based photogrammetry to our toolkit, or the range of solutions that we provide. And the emphasis here is not really on replacing fieldwork or field characterization studies, but to supplementing those approaches and to use digital photogrammetry as a means of extracting quantitative structural information from outcrop reconstructions. We run a series of training courses. We offer many training modules, both in class and in the field. And we have several joint industry projects. Several of those are now complete, but we're still running the Permian Basin Structural and Mechanical Stratigraphy Consortium. Just one slide on these joint industry projects. So you can see some of these completed: Carbonate Fault Project and the Eagleford. We're in phase 2 of the Permian Basin Structure and Mechanical Stratigraphy Consortium. And then future planning, we're working on a Austin Chalk Structure and Mechanical Stratigraphy one. We're in discussions based on interest from several companies. And in the future, we hope to start a drone photogrammetry and quantitative structural analysis project as well. Some of the justification for doing this internal research and development program was to get started on a future joint industry project. So please do get in touch if that's something that might be of interest to you. Okay, so let's talk a little bit about project background and rationale here. So this is an image on the right, is from one of my PhD papers in southwest Wales, from Veriscan, Pembrokeshire. The structure is probably about 15 or 20 meters high, not really accessible. It's only really accessible in its basal parts by hand or on foot. You can't really get up onto the structure. So outcrop reconstruction via photogrammetry can provide really, really high resolution reconstructions. As you can see here, these are really centimeter or millimeter scale reconstructions, and they can potentially yield large amounts of quantitative structural data. As I said, this particular structure is not easily accessible on foot, and that's one of the key advantages of digital photogrammetry. It allows you to digitally interrogate an outcrop and extract quantitative structural information from it. Other potential advantages include things like rapid data acquisition and reduced time in the field. And to my mind anyway, there's improved scope for statistical treatment of data. And that really comes from the improved ability to sample an outcrop more uniformly and more comprehensively, perhaps, than you would be able to by hand. These are pretty things to look at, and people like showing them off, but there are a number of key steps that need to be followed if you're going to be able to extract reliable, robust structural information from them. And they include things like image acquisition protocols, processing parameters, and the use of control data. When I say control data, I mean ground control points in the form of differential GPS that really allow you to nail down where your outcrop is in the world and to make sure it's the right size. There are no internal inconsistencies, no distortions, and that everything is geometrically faithful to what that outcrop actually looks like in the real world. So why do we do this sort of photogrammetry stuff, and why do we do field work? Well, I mean, I don't think this sort of figure, I'm sure everyone's seen something similar to this in the past, but really what we're trying to do is address this scale gap between what we can see in well bores, so vertical or horizontal wells that are only capable of sampling quite a small part of a given rock volume in the subsurface. And although the measurements and the observations that we can make in those well bores are very high resolution, and we can get lots of really important geological information out of them, wells are typically widely spaced across basins or across fields, so interpolating between wells can be tough, as I'm sure everyone knows. And even the best modern broadband seismic data doesn't really bridge that gap between, allow us to interpolate properly between wells. The best broadband modern shallow seismic may have resolutions down to a few meters. If you're looking for faults and fractures or brittle failure surfaces, I would suggest that resolution isn't particularly good for finding small scale features, which can be really important for fluid flow in the subsurface. So field work, really, that red box there is about addressing that sampling gap in between those two scales of observation. As I mentioned before, field work, because of local topography at outcrops or difficulty with accessibility, that sampling box that we're looking at, that red sampling box of traditional field work, is probably more like a weird shaped polygon, depending on the size and shape and nature of your outcrop. So the idea with digital photogrammetry or close range remote sensing is to be able to extend the size of that sampling domain up into larger horizontal and vertical sampling sizes, but also to be able to acquire data and to extract data more uniformly across the sampling domain. As I said before, this is not about replacing traditional field work, but rather supplementing traditional field methods. And for us, the best approach is a dual approach, where we take those small scale field observations, those detailed observations of things like kinematic indicators, measurements in the field, really small scale stuff that are of fundamental importance to understanding the processes that occurred, and taking those observations and then using that information to maybe map a larger domain across a larger area. Okay, so that's a little bit of background, and then one more background slide. And so this cartoon block diagram on the left sort of provides a bit of an overview of what I said on the last slide about sampling domain. So if we take a hypothetical outcrop that exposes a couple of normal faults and a relay ramp and multiple stratigraphic exposures, sampling that domain is typically not that easy doing normal field work. And the approach here is to take that outcrop and to assign variables to different grid cells across the structure. So if we look at C, D, and E there, and bear in mind this is a cartoon, but what we do is we make some grid cells, evenly spaced grid cells, and we assign variables to those grid cells. So for example, C here is structural position. So these numbers correspond to either footwall, hanging wall, or relay ramp. We can measure bed thickness and assign those same assign those variables to the same cells, and similarly with proximity to fault or any other structural stratigraphic variable that we can think of. And the idea then is that we, for example, if we're looking at fault or fracture abundance or intensity, we can relate that intensity or abundance to not only a single variable, but multiple variables. And as you all know, there have been many different studies over the last decades looking at how the occurrence of faults and fractures is influenced by different factors. So for example, structural position, distance from fault, or bed thickness. And the idea here is to try to combine multiple variables to see if we can get a better handle on how these multiple variables interact to influence fracture occurrence. Okay, so that's a bit of background. Next, we're going to be going to the study area, which actually, to my mind, provides a pretty good approximation of what we're looking here. Really good 3D exposure, multiple stratigraphic heights exposed, and some structure. So this is Canyon Lake Gorge. I believe that some of you in the talk will have been here with our group. So this is a dam that's about 35 miles as the crow flies northeast from the center of San Antonio. And the dam was built to serve flood control and water conservation on the Guadalupe River. Construction began in '58, and the reservoir was filled by '68. Full capacity is at 943 feet above sea level. So in 2002, late June to early July 2002, 34 inches of rain were recorded in the Guadalupe River watershed. And the spillway that you can see in the bottom image there started overflowing. And the maximum height of water flowing over that spillway was 7 foot. during that time. The spillway was overflowing for approximately 6 weeks, and that overflow would have filled Canyon Lake 1.5 times. So it was a really big event, a massive flood event. And essentially what that did is that it carved out what we see today exposed as Canyon Lake Gorge below the spillway. I found some Google imagery yesterday that I was nosing around and had a look. So this is an image from 1998 before the flood. This is the dam on the left, and you can see the spillway up here that was constructed as an emergency spillway. Down here is a sort of typical Texas hill country valley, pretty vegetated, no exposed rock that we're looking at there. And then an image from 10 years later. This is what it looked like. So there was a lot of material that came out of there. You scale bar on bottom left there, 200 meters, and all of this is now beautifully exposed, and it makes a fantastic natural laboratory for the structural geologist. Many faults and fractures, really great exposure. There's a more recent photo, and as you can see, it hasn't changed too much. What I can tell you, though, from having looked at photos from soon after the flood, is that the vegetation is definitely starting to creep in, and you can see that the carbonates here have been weathered to some degree, so they're getting sort of darker, but generally still fantastic exposure. Okay, these are some photos from soon after the flood, and as you can see, how well exposed it is, how free of vegetation it is, excellent fault and fracture exposures. And this is a geologic map of the area that was built by the group over several years and published in APG Bulletin in 2011. This is quite a zoomed out version I'm showing you here, but when you look at this in detail, there is a lot of detail. This area has really been mapped in great detail by the group. Okay, that's all I wanted to show you for there. So let's move on to a little bit of geologic setting. Just one couple of slides about where we sit regionally in terms of structure. So let's look at the map on the right first. Canyon Lake Gorge is marked by this yellow star here. What we're looking at here is early Cretaceous carbonates in the dark green here above the Balcones fault zone. This is the Balcones fault zone marked by these red fault strands here. These faults, so we're looking at, footwall here and hanging wall down here, down thrown to the southeast, which is associated with Gulf of Mexico extension and regional subsidence. On this map, the Gulf of Mexico is just off the bottom right corner here. You can see in the hanging wall to this Balcones fault zone, we've got some late Cretaceous rocks exposed here, and these rocks are at the surface progressively younger down to the Gulf of Mexico from Paleogene up to Neogene and Quaternary. The San Antonio relay ramp sits here, which is sits in between these two segments of the major segments of the Balcones fault zone. And exposed to Canyon Lake Gorge is the Glen Rose limestone, which is Albian in age, and this is an approximate depositional map for that time. I think this is a 110 MA time slice. This is a Ron Blakey map, and what you can see is we're sitting right on in a marginal marine setting. So the carbonate rocks at Canyon Lake Gorge, we're pretty much in a carbonate world. The succession is carbonate dominated, but there's a lot of variability here, and I think we're pretty close to a source of detrital input at times. So we're certainly not in a deep marine setting, but very shallow marginal marine. I think that's probably enough on that. So let's move on. But the main point here really is that we're in a normal faulting stress regime, and extension down to the southeast, and we're very much still in that structural position here in Canyon Lake Gorge, although we're in the footwall to this major Balcones escarpment. Okay, so normal faulting stress regime. This is from the Farrell et al. Paper 2017. And so at Canyon Lake Gorge, we see most of these failure surfaces. So we have tensile failure, hybrid failure, shear failure, and compactive shear failure. We record all of these at Canyon Lake Gorge. And the orientations of these surfaces, as a reminder to everyone, I'm sure everyone probably knows this, but tensile failure surfaces are perpendicular to the minimum principal stress marked here by sigma 3. And then the hybrid shear and compactive shear surfaces are parallel to the intermediate principal stress marked here as sigma 2. And they're oblique or inclined with respect to the maximum principal stress. So we see this whole range of structures at Canyon Lake Gorge, and based on the previous work that is done there, these all fit approximately into a normal faulting, a consistent normal faulting regime. That is the main fault at Hidden Valley Fault falls within too. Okay, so that's a bit of background on the structure. Couple more slides on background geologic setting. This is that Glen Rose Formation that you saw on the map a couple of slides back. And as you can see, if we expand out the lithostratigraphy for Canyon Lake Gorge, the middle part of this figure is Schmidt rebound, which is a proxy for unconfined compressive strength. And what you can see in these gray bars is there really is a lot of variability here in the mechanical strength of these rocks. So the Glen Rose on the whole then is represented by a sort of fine scale mix of competent and incompetent units through the stratigraphy. And, you know, I think this is really at the largest scale caused by that depositional position where we're really in a marginal marine setting. So we get episodic input of detrital components, some intervals that are more enriched with clay, whereas some intervals are much more clean and more carbonate rich. And this is what's really defining this sort of variability here. Above the Glen Rose is the Edwards group, which is pretty much acts regionally as a relatively competent beam. And then above that in the Del Rio clay, butyl limestone, Eagleford shale is a more incompetent at the largest scale. Our study area is here in the lower part of about 2/3 of the way down Canyon Lake Gorge. And this is the piece of stratigraphy exposed here. We're going to look at that in a little bit more detail in a second. Okay, a note before we go on mechanical stratigraphy. So mechanical stratigraphy really refers to the mechanical properties of the rock, which is more or less shown by this rebound profile here. And those mechanical properties are controlled by mineralogy and texture, predominantly controlled by mineralogy and texture. What you can see here from the lithostratigraphy profile, so these are rock types here. This is a sort of grain size or weathering profile. You can see a key in here. What I would say based on looking at this is that lithostratigraphy alone really is not a great predictor of mechanical stratigraphy. There's no easy way to look at this and make a prediction of what we think the unconfined compressive strength or Schmidt hammer rebound might be for this. And I would argue, and I'm going to show you some of these results later, that mineralogy is a much more important control than texture. Other components of mechanical stratigraphy are thickness of mechanical layers and the frictional properties of layer interfaces, which we'll also discuss a little bit later on. Okay, last slide before I actually show you some data. This is a previous study by Ronnie McGuinness et al. 2015, who did some work in exactly the same area. And these are a couple of their findings. So they find no clear relationship between frequency or spacing of opening mode fractures and proximity to the main fault trace. This is the main fault trace down here. We're in the footwall to that main fault trace in our study area. And they also found no detectable relationship between fracture spacing and bed thickness. I've circled these pavements here in black, and you can see that the relationships are not very clear between fracture spacing and bed thickness. These are enlarged portions of those little fracture maps, and you can see that even between these different bedding pavements, the fracture patterns are substantially different. So which suggests to me at least that these units are not sort of deforming, you know, in a coupled mechanical way, but rather the deformation is sort of partitioned between them. Okay, plenty of background. Let's have a look at the study area itself. So this is us. We're looking onto the outcrop here on the left-hand side, looking approximately southwest. These are those pavements in black that you can see here. Those are from the previous slide, these pavements, just to give you some context of where we are. Blues are stratigraphic horizons, picks. These are just the names of the different stratigraphic units that we assigned. The greens are the green dots here are locations of Schmidt rebound and sample, XRD sampling locations we did in the field. Yellows are DGPS control points to make sure our digital outcrop is correctly georeferenced, scaled, and oriented. And the reds here are where we made detailed observations on faults, looked for kinematic indicators like silicon lines or down to millimeter scale offset to tell us whether these were the mode or the failure mode of these different faults and fractures. To me, this is a super exposure for doing this kind of study because it's so 3D, and we can really go after those different inputs and different controlling factors on fracture abundance. So we've got multiple stratigraphic exposure levels, we've got different proximities to the fault, and we have a lot of faults and fractures exposed in 3D. And I think this digital outcrop was made from about 6,000 aerial images, which is probably slightly overkill, but it allowed us to really nail down the geometry of the outcrop internally. Here's another view. So we're standing about here digitally looking onto the structure, and you can see we classified the faults and fractures into 3 categories in this case. So faults with observed offset and or silicon lines. So we had to be able to see in the field that this was definitely a fault, not just a fracture that was oriented in this orientation. The pinks here are lower angle, lower than 70-degree dip fractures. We call them fractures in this case because we can't definitively say that they're faults or fractures. I'm going to talk about that in a second. And then higher angle structures are shown here in yellow. What you might be able to see here is that there are a bunch of faults and fractures here that we didn't digitize or map. So there are some sets here in this pavement that we're looking at that are perpendicular to these yellows. So all of the structures that we mapped here were predominantly parallel or sub-parallel to the main Hidden Valley fault in the area. These are the dominant fracture sets in this area. So, and because we were projecting these fault and fracture traces onto a cross section, to avoid any bias with projection vectors and that kind of thing, we decided to go after just the most systematic fracture set or fracture sets, which are these ones parallel or sub-parallel to the Hidden Valley fault. Okay, a couple of quick looks at the digital outcrop. Here's a sort of overview, an aerial view looking down onto the pavement. You can see these fracture traces that I was talking about here. But as I said, we were only mapping these ones along here that were parallel to the Hidden Valley fault. This link, by the way, will take you to a digital version of this outcrop. If you want to have a look at it in 3D, go and check that out. And if we look at the triangle mesh on here, that gives you some idea of what kind of resolution we're talking about here. So pretty high resolution, sort of centimeter scale triangles. Okay. So the lithostratigraphy then, this is adapted from that Ferrell et al. 2011 paper. Generally, we're looking at a shallow marine or marginal marine environment. You can see these fossil assemblages here on with the gray backgrounds, so ooids, gastropods, ostracods, bivalves, and we classified these units into two sort of end members. So we call them packstone or packstone dominated units, shown in blue here, or waxstone or waxstone dominated units, shown in green. And the waxstones are generally finer grained, more clay rich, and they tend to be more recessive. What you're looking at here on this log is a weathering profile across here. So the greens are in some cases more recessive than the blues, than the packstones. But lots of alternations here. You know, we're looking at 1, 2, 3, 5 meters of exposed section here, but a lot of alternation in depositional environment here. Here's some photomicrographs showing different fossil assemblages in these different units. Okay, let's look at some field images. So the first place I'm going to take you is just over here, and we're looking at units 1, 2, 3, and 4. So a couple of fairly competent packstone units, and then down into a waxstone interval here, unit 4. Okay, so let's have a look. So this is what that looks like from the field. This is just schematically showing you that the Hidden Valley Fault is somewhere off to our left. It's got about 55 to 63 meters of throw on it, and it's the dominant fault in the area. It's really the biggest fault around. So we're in the footwall to the Hidden Valley Fault here. And so we have a series of faults and fractures, pretty low angle. And you can see that there are some of these that look like they're apparently synthetic to the Hidden Valley Fault, and some of these that are antithetic. So if I put some annotation on top then, again, using our classification of before, the reds here are where we directly observed offset or slicken lines along these failure surfaces. So these are, we categorically classify these as faults. The reds. The pinks are what we define as low angle fractures in this case, that we do not directly see indicators of slip along them. And the yellows are high angle faults and fractures. Based on the regional stress orientation here at Canyon Lake Gorge and what we would expect the orientation of shear fractures to be in this general framework, our interpretation here is that these are incipient shear fractures that may have accumulated very, very, very small amounts, some possibly millimeter scale displacement, but we don't see any direct evidence for displacement along these surfaces. And that's really consistent with a normal faulting regime. In the view of this picture, we're looking down the barrel of sigma 2, the intermediate principal stress. Sigma 3 comes across the page here, and sigma 1 is vertical. And that's consistent for both these structures dipping to the right in this field of view and to the left, which we interpret as conjugate structures. Although we don't see any indication of slip along these surfaces, we're hesitant to classify these as opening mode fractures, and mainly because that requires a stress tensor that's inconsistent with regional, both the Balcones fault system regionally and with the Hidden Valley Fault more locally. Further, if we don't call these oppositely dipping structures antithetic structures, but we call them opening mode fractures, then there's a requirement to rotate sigma 1 or sigma 3, the minimum principal compressive stress, by 90 degrees to form these different sets, which we think is probably unlikely. So although we don't really record directly information for slip, we classify these as incipient shear fractures. Okay. And then at the broad scale, what you can see then is that a lot of these structures sort of are present across this entire packstone interval, or much of this packstone interval. But very quickly, when you get into the more fine-grained clay-rich waxstone below, these features tend to terminate relatively abruptly. And that's really a common theme that we see through much of this area. I'll show you some more of these in a second. So here's some more field images, and what you can see is both faults and opening mode fractures on the left that terminate at clay-rich intervals or partings. So this guy is sort of, this fracture here is contained within this upper unit and appears to terminate downward into this parting here. Very thin, presumably relatively clay-rich parting. We get another fault here that terminates upwards. And then on the right-hand side here, we've got a zoom in of this area. And what we can see is that even a few centimeters thickness of clay-rich interval, sort of limestone marl, is enough to inhibit propagation of normal faults. So there's probably a couple of centimeters of displacement on these two normal faults above and below this unit. But what you can see in detail here is that this fault is not hard linked across this fine-grained interval, and it just can't make it across this fine-grained interval. So it doesn't, for me, this shows really that it doesn't take much thickness of clay or mudstone to inhibit fault or fracture propagation. So there's only one on the left-hand side here. We only identify one fault or fault zone that crosses multiple mechanical layers, and this is a complex zone of linked slip surfaces. But the general theme here is this sort of bed-contained fault or fractures that terminate abruptly at these mudstone units, or these partings in between the more competent beds. Okay, these green bits of duct tape on the rock are sample locations, by the way. Okay, and then the same pattern in other places. So these are normal faults, sort of synthetic and antithetic to the larger Hidden Valley fault. Couple of millimeters displacement on these individual fault surfaces, but again, which is, at least it was surprising to me, is these faults are really contained within individual mechanical units. And they just can't punch through below through the partings, the clay-rich partings into the layers below. Okay, so a little bit on orientations and digital fault and fracture mapping. This is just showing you the orientations of these different surfaces that we extracted digitally. So, and you can see, so the white triangle here is the main Hidden Valley fault, and you can see that we've got some fairly convincing clusters of synthetic and antithetic surfaces to the main Hidden Valley fault here, though with some spread. If we compare that to field data, so field data here in white, the white dots, digital data in black, we can see that it's fairly close agreement. And the averages of these different populations fit, so the average of the synthetic population gets pretty close to the main Hidden Valley fault. So, I mean, this was the point I was talking to earlier about these parallel or subparallel trending structures to the Hidden Valley fault. Okay, so we used this information to take those 3D polylines and project them onto a cross-section. I'm going to show you the cross-section next. And this is what those faults and fractures look like in cross-section view. So we spent some time over here looking at some field images out here on the digital outcrop. And this is where those fall on the cross-section. And what you can see here is that I should mention that the blues, the shades of blues here correspond to clay weight percent. So high clay content is darker blue and low clay content is pale blue. And what you can see at the biggest scale is that the intervals with higher clay percentages are generally have lower fracture densities or fracture abundances. So this is one of those areas I showed you before where these faults and fractures tend not to propagate very far down into the clay-rich layers. That is not always the case. I mean, there are examples where some of the maybe more clay-rich layers have a few more fractures, but the general pattern here is low clay equals more fractures. And then that's that single structure I showed you earlier that propagates across multiple mechanical units. Okay, and then if we look at some other variables that we collected at the outcrop, so this is rebound for each of those 12 units that we're looking at in the cross section. This is total clay weight percentage. You can see that it's fairly variable, but we don't get clay percentages over 10% here. Quartz and feldspars, total carbonate, and fracture intensity. And just visually, I think there is some relationship here between these different variables. So for example, if we look at total clay and fracture intensity, you might think that, well, total clay is higher where fracture intensity is lower, for example, and vice versa. So the next couple of slides, we're going to look at some cross plots of these and really dig into, try to quantify these different relationships between these multiple variables. Okay, so starting on the left-hand side then, part A, so total clay percent and fracture intensity. I mentioned that visually they look like there was some correlation there. And we have a moderate correlation of 0.49 in this case. So an increase in fracture intensity with a decrease in total clay weight percentage. The wax stones in this plot are shown by these black dots here. And you can see that sort of clays of around 7.8, something like that, and higher are wax stones. But are generally a pretty good relationship here. And I think that this is overall what we would expect. So lower clay percentages, stronger rock, more intensely fractured. When I say stronger rock, I mean, I'm using that term quite loosely, but more brittle, more prone to brittle failure. If we look at the plot below that one and we compare total carbonate to fracture intensity, what we're looking at essentially is the inverse of the clay versus fracture intensity plot. So as clay increases, carbonate drops, and we see a similar kind of relationship here. So a positive correlation between fracture intensity and carbonate. So more carbonate, stronger rock, more prone to brittle failure. Quartz and feldspars was a little bit confusing in the beginning because what we see here is that higher quartz and feldspar percentages equals lower fracture intensity, which is not what you would expect, for example, in a clastic environment, where more clean sandstones would likely be stronger and more prone to brittle failure. But I think really what these quartz and feldspars are recording in this case is just that detrital input that we see at the site. Remember that depositional setting sort of map I showed you early on. And what this is recording then is high clay and high quartz and feldspar, clay and quartz and feldspars are really well correlated here. So where clay is high, quartz and feldspar is high. So this is just a detrital signal that we're looking at here. And in this setting, we don't really attribute quartz to increased rock strength, quartz and feldspars to increased rock strength like we would in a clastic world. Okay, some more cross plots then. So A on the left-hand top left there, fracture intensity versus rebound. This is a fairly, not a bad correlation either. And this is generally what we would expect. So higher Schmidt rebound with increased fracture intensity. So again, a similar pattern. Higher rebound equals stronger, more competent units, more prone to brittle failure. Whereas lower rebound is indicative of possibly deformation, rocks that are more likely to deform in a ductile manner. Okay, and then if we look at that rebound versus carbonate, that sort of backs up that relationship that we just looked at here. So high rebound equals high carbonate equals stronger rock, which equals higher fracture intensity. And then the inverse is true. So if we look at clay versus rebound, that's essentially just the inverse of this plot that we're looking at here. Because clay and carbonates in this case are inversely proportionate, roughly. And then finally, looking here at fracture intensity and average bed thickness, we get a correlation coefficient of 0.16, and this is the lowest we got for any of these cross plots. You should recall that quote from Ronnie McGuinness's paper 2015 said they really found no relationship between bed thickness and fracture spacing at the site. And we come to the same conclusion. The relationship we see here is certainly nowhere near as good as that very early slide I showed you, Ladira and Price, or Wayne Nair's work looking at fracture spacing and bed thickness. And I think really that's because, well, a couple of things. So first of all, mineralogy is really dominant here, and it really controls where we see the fractures propagating and being contained. And the second thing is the majority of fracture spacing bed thickness papers focus on a single lithology. And here we're focusing on multiple lithologies, so we're not really comparing apples with apples. But irrespective, we would probably expect the trend line on this to go from top left to bottom right. So either way, we're finding a particularly poor bed thickness fracture spacing relationship here. Okay, a couple of summary slides. So I think we've shown that mechanical stratigraphy strongly controls fault and fracture occurrence. Unit composition, particularly clay minerals versus carbonate content, really controls how these rocks deform, the deformation style, fracture intensity, and the fracture containment. Clay-rich waxstone units show low fracture intensities. And both opening mode fractures and faults within competent packstone units, they terminate at competent and incompetent interfaces, or shortly after propagating into relatively weak clay-rich units. And the poor correlations between layer thickness and fracture intensity we attribute to the wide range of compositions we see, and really the dominance of mineralogy in defining fracture propagation and containment. The thicknesses of these relatively incompetent clay-rich layers control the likelihood for faults and fractures to propagate across layer boundaries and through multiple layers. And by that, I mean where faults and fractures have millimeter to centimeter scale displacement along them, you really don't need a very thick clay-rich interval to arrest propagation of that layer. Of course, if you've got a fault with 50 or 100 meters of displacement on it, then a 5 centimeter thick clay-rich layer is not going to be enough to arrest propagation of that failure surface. And the ability for a failure surface, really shear failure surface, to propagate across weak layers depends on the interplay of that, the displacement magnitude, the ductility contrasts between lithologic units, and the relative thicknesses of competent and incompetent layers. And I think future research could focus on exploring this space in more detail. And so finally, I've said this a bunch of times, but really rock texture and bed thickness are poor predictors of fracture intensity in this case. And composition or mineralogy really dominantly controls fracture occurrence at the site. And that's it. There are some references, and I'll take any questions. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Adam. That was fantastic. We have a question for you, and I encourage others to type any questions into the Q&A chat. Kyle Bracken has a question. On slide 30, you noted the larger normal fault that cut across several mechanical layers. Did you observe the failure mode changing along this fault with the different mechanical units, shear, compactive shear, etc., as the percent clay changed?
In short, we didn't really see that in detail. It's a really complicated, messy fault zone in there, and it can be quite difficult to directly observe the different failure modes within that. Although the exposure is great, as I mentioned, since the flood in the early 2000s, a lot of these little crevices and things get more and more filled up with mud and debris, and we do as much as we can to clean them up, but in cases the exposure is just not quite good enough to nail that down. So I know that's not much of an answer, but we didn't directly observe that.
Okay, great. Radu Buza, pardon, said, thanks for the presentation, Adam. How long do you think it took in time for these faults to be created, and how much impact do you think exposure to burial depth had on these mechanical features?
So how long it took, I don't have a good feeling for that. I think I'm going to plead ignorance on that one. In terms of burial, we don't, I mean, these are the faults and fractures that we see at Canyon Lake Gorge, and through, decades of work on this stuff, looking at mineralization, calcite mineralization, for example, we don't relate these things directly to, say, uplift or exhumation or surface processes, but rather these are, and the orientations and the failure modes are consistent with that. These are really Gulf of Mexico related extension features. Yeah.
Okay, great. Bill Gomez had a question on slide 32. Were faults and opening mode fractures mixed in the page 20 P21 fracture intensity calculation? And if so, why not separate them? And then the second question is, what are roughly the number of faults fractures used to calculate fracture intensity? Could results be affected by low number of samples?
Okay, so so the first question was about why we mix and why we don't separate them out from each other. I think the justification for mixing them in this case is that we have failure surfaces that are consistent with regional extension, Gulf of Mexico extension, and all of these structures are parallel or subparallel to the Hidden Valley Fault. So they're all recording extension in that stress regime. So I think it's appropriate because, and what we're looking at is the amount of brittle failure in a particular bed versus, possibly ductile deformation that we just can't see. So I think that's the reason that we lump them together. The second part is how we did the counting. So what we're looking at here is it's not simply counting fractures, but our fracture intensity value here is total fracture length per unit area for each of these units. So the way we calculated that is we take unit 1, we measure its 2D area in cross-section view, and then we take the total fracture fault and fracture length of all structures in that bed, and we divide it by that area. There was another part to that question.
Could your results be affected by a low number of samples?
Yeah, I mean, I think we can get around that to some degree by doing this, this total line length per unit area calculation rather than just single fracture counting. We were really precise about mapping the exact terminations of all of these fractures. We did it once, we went back to the field, reinterpreted it again, and this is a pretty refined interpretation as it looks here.
Yeah. A comment from Orlando Ortega. If you've not looked at paper by Ortega et al. In JSG, fracture intensity and stratigraphic controls, I recommend to take a look. Indeed, mineralogy, particularly degree of dolomitization, was an important factor in fracture intensity, which, by the way, was normalized by size.
Yeah, thanks, Orlando. I've been looking at that paper recently for another study, so more on that soon.
Gary Pro said, do you anticipate that the results you see here in carbonates would also apply to clastic mechanically layered rocks?
Yes, I would. And I think that we do see that. So if you see multi-layer successions in siliciclastic environments, so let's very simply say mudstone shale lithologies. I think that what we find is that more commonly the mudstones or the stronger, more competent rocks are more likely to fail by brittle deformation. And that the mudstones, the fine grain, the clay-rich layers deform in a ductile manner. What I would say in that case, which is not the same as in this result, in the clastic world, higher quartz and feldspar proportions would equal more competent, more likely to fail by brittle failure, which is not the case here.
Okay. Kyle Bracken, another question. Was there a correlation between the failure angle of the fault fractures and clay percentage? Where were the low angle, less than 70-degree features only found in the higher clay units?
So the first part to that is we didn't directly look at that, and the answer to the second part of that question is no. So if you look at this slide, what you can see is that these low angle faults and fractures are actually dominant in this rock unit with the lower clay percentages. So I don't think there's really necessarily a straightforward relationship between those two in this case. Yeah.
Okay, fantastic. Adam, I want to thank you again for presenting today. It's now 1 o'clock. So if anyone has further questions, you can reach out to Adam at Southwest Research Institute. Otherwise, be on the lookout for our April webinar when we send that out. Thank you, everyone. And Adam, thanks again.
Pleasure. Thanks, everyone. Bye-bye.